Today we're launching a new regular series with our chief political consultant, Marc Ambinder. Each Monday we're going to take a look at a few political races in this exciting election year. So Marc, this week we're going to start off with the Senate race in Florida.
And the word of the day is payback, and it goes directly to the dynamic of this race. About a year ago, Charlie Crist, governor of Florida, was the GOP golden boy. Why? He'd done a pretty good job as governor of his state. He was fairly popular. Right now, though, he's losing to Marco Rubio, former Florida House Speaker, in the primaries. And one of the main reasons is because people don't think Crist has a political core. Well, today, Rudy Giuliani is campaigning with Marco Rubio. And there's a reason why Rudy Giuliani, former New York mayor, is campaigning with Rubio. And it's because Crist, during the Republican primaries last time, had promised, or allegedly promised Giuliani, but we all know he pretty much promised Giuliani that he'd get the endorsement of Crist, which, as those of you who follow primary history know, went to John McCain instead.
Well, and that's because at the time, Crist, who reached out to Democrats, was kind of the darling centrist.
He was the darling centrist, and his endorsement helped John McCain win the Republican primary in Florida, and it hurt Rudy Giuliani's presidential ambition so much it pretty much threw him out of the race.
Well, that's right. Florida was the place Giuliani went to die. He'd staked it all on Florida, and he was going to come back and throw this big knockout punch.
So this race is not so much about moderate versus conservative liberal, because Giuliani's not the most conservative Republican, but it's really about authenticity and fidelity to the Republican Party, and that's where Marco Rubio has a strength.
Excellent. All right, let's move on now to the governor's race in Ohio. What's happening there?
Well, one thing to note about the governor's races in general this year is you're going to have at least 23 new governors, regardless of party, although probably a lot of them are going to be Republican. So you're going to have an entirely new crop, and it's going to give us a new crop of politicians. But one state where we're going to have either a familiar name, if one of the two familiar names is going to be Ohio, but it also represents something larger about
and
the governor's races in general. Ted Strickland is the incumbent governor of Ohio. His likely Republican opponent will be John Kasich, the former long-time member of Congress there, who's making a political comeback. The polls are kind of moving around a little bit. Strickland has a little bit of an edge now, but it's a really tough state. It's a Midwestern state. The unemployment rate is a full point higher than the national average. Personal income is lower than the national average. It's going to be a tough state for any incumbent to win, but it indicates, and you see this throughout the Midwest, a lot of incumbent Democrats, for example, Chet Culver in Iowa, simply facing a lot of political peril simply because the economy is so bad.
And Ohio used to be a bad state there was a period where it was a terrible state for Republicans.
Because the state party was essentially corrupt and had no candidates who were non-tinged or weren't tinged to corruption, which is one reason why they went back and found John Kasich, who had retired before all of that began. But whomever wins this state is going to join at least 23, 24, perhaps many as 27 or 28 completely new members of the gubernatorial crop. So essentially what you're seeing in the states this year is a mass turnover and really fertile ground for political superstars in the future.
And we see in John Kasich, just as the echoes of the past here, Kasich was one of the darlings of the '94 revolution when Republicans took control and said, we're going to balance the budget. And he was a darling from that era.
And very briefly, Strickland was a darling of sort of this early 90s wave of pragmatic, moderate Democratic governors. So if he loses, if Chet Culver loses, you may see the end of that era as well.
Excellent. All right, our last race is a fabulous one in Kentucky.
This is
Senate race.
Terribly fascinating. The Republican primary in itself, I think, will demonstrate how salient the Tea Party movement is in terms of Republican primaries, because you have Rand Paul, the son of Ron Paul, a former presidential candidate. Rand Paul is an eye surgeon. He's a social conservative. He's running a very conservative anti-Washington platform against the hand-picked Republican nominee, or the potential Republican nominee, Trey Grayson, who was endorsed by establishment figures like Mitch McConnell, who is sort of the dean of Republicans in Kentucky, and by Dick Cheney. And yet he's losing more and more every day to this young up-and-comer named Rand Paul, who, if conservative Republicans in that state really, for example, knew what Rand Paul thought about foreign policy, they might not be willing to give him that much of a shot. But this will test whether the anti-Washington energy in the Republican Party is, I think, the predominant ideology. And if it happens, if Paul ousts Grayson in this primary, One thing you could do is give either of the two Democrats who are running, Attorney General Jack Conway and the former Lieutenant Governor Dan Mangiardo, a chance to win too. This is a dynamic to watch, whether because of Tea Party support for Republican candidates, whether Republican candidates elected are far, even in a state like Kentucky, are too far to the right to be elected in a general.
Right, and Rand Paul being endorsed by Sarah Palin.
He was endorsed by Sarah Palin. And even though his father has some issues with the Tea Party movement, the movement in general has really coalesced around Rand Paul, made him one of their own.
Let me ask you a final question. What you mentioned is also true of the Florida race, which is to say these bloody Republican primaries, they may create an ideological candidate who's out of the mainstream,
right,
but they also sap money. Is that also what's at stake here?
They sap money and they bloody up. Rand Paul will emerge from this, but he'll emerge from the primary being, a very decidedly conservative, and again, even in some ways outside the mainstream of the conservative movement, because Rand Paul is an extreme economic libertarian. He's an isolationist in foreign policy, and that's not where the locus of conservative. A little bit less so in Florida, because Marco Rubio was essentially, you're seeing a lot of establishment figures now coming around in favor of Marco Rubio because Crist is just proving a bad candidate. Crist, incidentally, we'll know in about a month or so, may decide to run with no party affiliation, which may make that race even more interesting.
All right, Marc Ambinder, thanks so much.